So we need to talk about what I call the nightmare scenario. And this is kind of a long, drawn-out story, but bear with me on this because I'm a little worried. I mean, you can see how desperate the governments of the world are to start a war, a major war. I mean, we're already in World War III, technically. War with 10 countries on 2 continents under U.S. military doctrine, that's a world war, but people don't see it as such yet. And again, go back and look at the history of World War II. Long before Pearl Harbor happened, you know, there was the war in the North Atlantic, there was China and the Flying Tigers, there were, you know, French Indochina, all these little skirmishes going on all over the place. Everybody was fighting with everybody. But it took Pearl Harbor for everybody to say, ah, yes, it's now a world war. Big mistake number 2. Now we have to realize we have to start numbering them. So we can see that with this Turkey thing, with all of this Iran's non-existent weapons of mass destruction, they're trying to sell you a new world war because they can't think of anything better to do. We messed it up. We can't solve it. Let's just blow it all up and nobody will notice that we were the real cause for the destruction of modern civilization. So here's my nightmare scenario. Let's start with a couple of obvious and unpleasant facts. The debt-based economy of the private banks has failed and is collapsing because of this little system where they issue all public currency as a loan at interest. And that means more debt is created than money with which to pay the debt, which makes the debt slavery permanent. Under the rules of private central banking, money can only enter circulation as the proceeds of another one of these loans at interest. So all these bailouts is simply more loans, plunging the subjugated populations deeper into debt. The private central bankers cannot change that rule without admitting to the public that the private central banking system had a fatal design flaw from the start. And governments that sold their populations into the slavery of private central banking cannot change the rules without admitting that they were stupid or corrupt or both for falling for the fraud in the first place. The Western banking system is imploding. And it all goes back to that 11th marble. Every 5-year-old child knows if you put 10 marbles into a can, you can only take 10 marbles out. There is no 11th marble. There never was. Private bankers think that they can put 10 marbles or $10 into the world economy and get $11 back. It doesn't work that way. And all these 11th marbles are piling up all over Europe, all over the United States of America. And nobody wants to admit the 11th marble isn't there. It's an article of faith that's somewhere out there is that 11th marble. And the system is coming unglued while everybody waits for that 11th marble. So the crash is coming. It's unavoidable. It's happening before your eyes. Every dirty trick they can think of, gaming the markets, printing up more money, moving money from one country to the other, trying to balance the load as it were, it's unavoidable. It's coming. The bankers and the governments know they cannot fix this problem. So they're desperate to find someone or something they can blame for the disaster. And war makes a great scapegoat for the greed of banking and the corruption of government, and it is a formula that has worked before. Economic crash, solve it by creating a war to blame the hardships and starvation on. Crash of 1907, solve it with World War I. Crash of 1929, solve it with World War II. Crash of 2008, and the United States and Wall Street are well on their way to solving it with World War III. That's the plan. That's what's going on here. And prior to the creation of the Federal Reserve, there was no such thing as a world war. Now, second point to keep in mind. There is not enough healthy and safe food to feed the present human population. Between mistakes with GMO crops, we'll be talking about that later in the show, diversion of food farms to ethanol production, the Gulf oil disaster, and now Fukushima, the already razor-thin surplus of food that was safe for human consumption has vanished, which is why you are being told that eating radioactive, oil-soaked, genetically damaged food is okay for you. Remember, Ann Coulter was out there, a little radiation is actually good for you. Reminds me of that funny little scene at the beginning of the movie Judge Dredd where this robot is going around with advertising saying, eat recycled food. It's good for the environment and okay for you. Now, in the eyes of the bankers and governments, there is a surplus of human beings. It's easy to be glib and say there's a population problem because sex is more fun than dying. But you can look at the vast expanses of empty land across the globe and realize the issue isn't too many humans for planet Earth, but too many for the current infrastructure built to sustain them. You see, it's kind of a two-edged sword. Governments want you to be dependent on the infrastructure they built because then they can harvest money from you. They don't want you going out and farming your own food and, living out in the wilderness and basically taking care of yourself because then you're of no use. So they build these giant human ranches called cities, and they lure you in, and they make you dependent on the food store and the electrical power and the water and everything in order to live inside the city. And then they harvest money and labor from you. But the problem is if they're not continuing to improve that infrastructure, if they're not keeping pace with the population growth, if they just let it decay, eventually you reach a point where the cost of repairing that decayed infrastructure becomes more than the money junkies want to pay. And they start thinking, might be a better solution to just get rid of the surplus human population, especially as factories become automated and laborers aren't needed. These are just useless eaters. We don't need them any longer. And at that point, governments and bankers think it's cheaper and easier to murder off a few billion people rather than have to spend the money to build decent communities to take care of them all. Now, this is not the first time this has happened. Europe during the medieval period neglected even the primitive infrastructure they had of the time. As the public baths built by Rome began to crumble, the church, instead of working to sustain hygiene and public health, simply taught the masses that bathing was a sin. And so the public stopped arguing for, the baths to be repaired, and disease took hold of the country. And then finally the Black Plague decimated the population, and all of a sudden there was ample food, room, and buildings for the survivors. And the political structure was off the hook without having to spend a farthing of their own money to do it. And that is the lesson the money junkies take from history, that there are advantages to killing off masses of people rather than having to take care of them, even though that is what we the people think government is supposed to be doing. All that is needed is a mechanism of mass death that hides the real agenda. A war, a plague, or both. And we got both in World War I, a war notable for the trench warfare system. Now, this was a system of soldiers in trenches urged repeatedly to run toward the other guy's trench right into the fire of cross machine guns and the clouds of poison gas. As warfare, it almost seemed intentionally designed to kill the maximum number of humans while damaging the least amount of real estate, which is, of course, the truly valuable thing out there. Then Germany collapsed. It almost seemed that somebody somewhere did a calculation and decided not enough humans had been killed because all of a sudden there was the Spanish flu. At the end of World War I, it's like all of a sudden somebody said, we really didn't get rid of enough people on this whole thing. And then all of a sudden they were having these supposed vaccine experimental tests at a U.S. military base called Camp Funston, Kansas. And all of a sudden this very lethal illness erupted out of it. And it was promptly called the Spanish flu so that people didn't start asking about Camp Funston. And it raced around the world, killing an estimated 30 to 40 million people. More than actually died in the World War, more than had died in the Black Plague. Here's the model. Got too much debt, got too many useless eaters who see the true nature of the banking system and the corruption of the government, want to head off a revolution and skip that whole guillotine inconvenient thing, start a war, or a plague, or both. But how to do it? Because after a decade of wars, selling a new and bigger war, that's a hard sell right now to the American people. Knock down another building and blame Muslims for it, that's passé. Been there, done that. Don't want the T-shirt. And knocking over the World Trade Towers or blowing up the Golden Gate Bridge lacks immediacy and presence. People don't feel a personal threat. If you live more than 50 miles away from New York, it was an event that happened somewhere else to some other people. It's a tragedy, but it's somebody else's tragedy. But a biological threat that hits everywhere, that might be in the very air you're breathing right now, The prostitutes of the corporate media could fan that immediate sense of dread into blind panic and lust for vengeance. So, this might be a possible scenario planned by the money junkies. And it ties in with all of these media stories we're seeing in the corporate media about how scientists took the bird flu, which bears a lot of resemblances to the Spanish flu. Their genomes are almost identical. And through a series of just 12 steps, converted it into a form easily transmissible by air. This thing will wipe all the people off the planet Earth. Now, this makes this new bug, and we're going to call it Captain Trips because that was the name of the super flu that was in Stephen King's book, The Stand. So we're going to call it Captain Trips. And I understand Jerry Garcia had that name as well, but we're going to reuse it for this situation. Now, the press gave a great deal of coverage to the possibility that the scientists who created Captain Trips are going to publish their step-by-step directions, and they ultimately did, thereby handing to Al-Qaeda, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, say no more, the recipe to wipe a significant part of mankind off the face of planet Earth. Osama bin Virus. Now, the press left a couple of things out, such as who was paying these scientists to create this horror, and why the government did not exercise its legal authority to classify any articles deemed dangerous to the national security. And more importantly, why the corporate media was basically broadcasting and advertising the availability of this recipe for Captain Trips for everybody to see. Because on the assumption that there are some real terrorists out there and not just these phonies like Adam Perlman running around, I don't think they spend their off hours thumbing through the peer-reviewed scientific literature. Now, the governments classify all kinds of documents. Here in the United States of America, college term papers that touch on military subjects can be and are routinely classified. And then their authors offered really huge, well-paying jobs with the defense contractors. Yet this supposedly highly dangerous recipe for converting Spanish bird flu into Captain Trips was published, which means the United States government wanted it published. And more to the point, they wanted the fact of its publication reported in the media, which means this is a propaganda operation. Now, back in 1974, there was a document, National Security Study Memorandum, 200 Implications of Worldwide Population Growth for U.S. Security and Overseas Interests. This was authored by Henry Kissinger. And during the Nixon administration, it actually became U.S. national policy briefly. It was discontinued under Ford, we are told. But it basically made covert population control measures in the third world official U.S. foreign policy. Now, in the 1990s, scientists, and again, we don't know who was paying them, exhumed the body of a victim of the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, preserved in the Alaskan permafrost, and successfully recovered the DNA of the Spanish flu virus. Now, the official reason given for this expedition was to be prepared in case the Spanish flu came back. There are some problems with that story. You and I and everybody listening to this show, we are the descendants of the people who survived the 1918 outbreak. And in theory, we have inherited their immunity. Over time, we do become immune to major diseases, which is why measles today is an inconvenience, but not the pandemic and slate wiper it once was when it first appeared. So an unaltered Spanish flu virus isn't a real threat today. Okay? Now, there's another aspect, and that has to do with viruses in the wild. As they mutate over time, as they evolve to less benign forms. I mean, if you think about it from an evolutionary point of view, a virus or a bacteria that immediately kills the host and melts them down into such a disgusting blob nobody will even come near them, that's not a successful life form because it's destroying its own ability to reproduce and procreate and spread. And so over time, all illness-causing bacteria and viruses will evolve to produce less symptoms until finally you will have them in your body. You won't even know that they're there as they go on spreading themselves all over the planet. That is an evolutionary successful bug. So if there was real Spanish flu still floating around the planet someplace, by now it has evolved to a much less harmful form. That's the way it works in nature. So that's why this story that they recovered the 1918 flu pandemic DNA, doesn't make any sense that they're just trying to get ready in case it comes back. Then remember we had that whole series of all those microbiologists who were dying under mysterious circumstances. They were dropping like flies here. Back in 2004, we started seeing propaganda that bird flu was going to be the next pandemic. It was in National Geographic. It's going to be worse than the 1918 flu virus. CDC was talking about recombinant viruses in 2005. And in 2005, it was admitted that CDC scientists were intentionally recreating the 1918 Spanish flu virus. They had the DNA. They were putting the protein coats back on. They were rebuilding this thing. Now, gene studies have shown that the bird flu is very similar to the 1918 Spanish flu. It's almost identical. And all of a sudden, it shows up just when CDC is playing with the 1918 flu. But the predicted pandemic, remember a couple of years ago, it's going to be horrible, you got to get vaccinations. It didn't happen because bird flu, at least as it presented itself in 2009, isn't that contagious. It had to be blended with a more infectious form of flu like swine flu. And in 2006, it was reported that CDC scientists were intentionally creating splices of bird flu and swine flu and human flu in the labs, which is why we were calling it the when pigs fly flu. So at this stage, it's clear this ultimate biological weapon has been created, but too many people know about it. We've been reporting about it, what really happened for quite some time. So they need a fall guy. They need a fall guy to blame this on. And this is where we go back to Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six, because the U.S. government can't come up with its own original plot line, so they're out there stealing it from books and everything. But which, by the way, was the plot line of 3 Days of the Condor. If you've ever seen the movie or read the book that it's based on, it's that the CIA just hired readers to go through science fiction and spy novels looking for plots and plans that they could actually use. So anyway, going from Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six, the plot line of that is there's a bunch of money junkies who've decided that Earth would be a much nicer place for them to live if they could get rid of the 99%. And the plot in the book is they have taken an altered version of the Ebola virus in the case of the book. They have a vaccine for themselves and then a phony vaccine they're going to sell to the rest of the world that won't actually work. And they wait for the Olympics and they spray everybody through the cooling system on the closing ceremony so that everybody's flying home during the incubation period and they don't feel anything. And they go to their homes and all of a sudden this pandemic explodes in all the major cities of the world all at the same time. And the technology to actually do that does exist. And that's why all of this talk about how easy it is to penetrate security at the London Olympics. And in fact, just yesterday I saw another story where somebody was saying that it takes only 3 steps to go from bird flu to the slate wiper and everything. There are so many reasons for the money junkies to want to kill off the surplus human population to get away from revolution and the rest of it. And I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong about this. And maybe by talking about this publicly will deter the people who are thinking about such things from trying to carry it out. And they'll say, they're going to suspect we did it. They won't fall for the Arabs did it and the Muslims did it hoax again. And maybe they'll call it off. And that's the reason to make these discussions public, is to give a moment of pause, to manufacture a sense of doubt. Because if we can make them doubt, they won't move forward with it. But there does seem to have been a lot of taxpayer-funded research into creating this super deadly flu. And we're seeing this propaganda campaign about biological weapons and, the terrorists can get the formula to manufacture this flu, and all these stories about how weak the security at the London Olympics are really going to be.
Mm-hmm.